"We're strangers," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, cutting through the quiet hum of the hospital corridor like glass under pressure. But the man in front of her didn't flinch, didn't even blink, just looked at her the way people look at something they've already lost once and somehow found again. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost gentle. "Not that night." The words hung between them, heavy, misplaced, as if they belonged to a memory she didn't have, and for a second, just one, Emma Collins felt something shift beneath her ribs, a flicker of recognition she couldn't explain, but she crushed it quickly, tightening her hold on the small bundle in her arms as her baby stirred softly against her chest, unaware of the tension tightening the air. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold glow across everything, peeling paint, scuffed floors, the quiet desperation of people waiting for answers they couldn't afford, and Emma forced herself to focus on what mattered, the weight of her daughter, Lily, barely 7 pounds and sleeping fitfully after a long night of fever that wouldn't break. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, her body running on caffeine and fear, her mind too crowded with numbers that didn't add up. $1, $240 for the ER visit, another $380 for tests, medication she hadn't even seen yet, and the balance in her checking account that sat stubbornly under $20. She shifted her stance, turning slightly away from the man as if that could erase the strange certainty in his gaze, but he didn't move, didn't step closer or back, just stood there in a tailored charcoal coat that looked out of place in a building where most people wore worry instead of luxury, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore, like something that didn't belong yet refused to leave. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, softer now, controlled, the way she spoke to customers when they got impatient at the diner, the way she kept her voice steady even when everything inside her wasn't, and for a moment she thought he might argue, might push, but instead he glanced down at the baby in her arms, his expression shifting, not to pity, not to curiosity, but something deeper, something that made her chest tighten without warning. "What's her name?" he asked, and Emma hesitated, just for a second, her instincts telling her not to answer, not to give anything away to a stranger who spoke like he knew pieces of her life she hadn't offered, but exhaustion has a way of weakening boundaries, and before she could stop herself, she said, "Lily." The name seemed to land harder than it should have, and the man's jaw tightened ever so slightly, his eyes softening in a way that didn't make sense, like he was hearing something he'd been waiting for, and Emma felt that strange flicker again, sharper this time, like a memory trying to surface through fog. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, grounding herself, adjusting the thin blanket around Lily's shoulders as the baby let out a quiet sigh, and that's when she noticed it, the way his hand twitched at his side, like he wanted to reach out but stopped himself, like he understood lines that shouldn't be crossed. "You should get her something warm," he said instead, nodding toward the vending machines at the end of the hall, his tone shifting back to neutral, practical, as if whatever had just passed between them had been imagined. "It gets cold in here at night." Emma followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him, suspicion threading through her exhaustion. "I'll manage," she replied, the words automatic, the same ones she used every day, because managing was what she did, managing rent, managing shifts, managing the quiet ache of doing everything alone. But something about the way he looked at her made the word feel smaller than it should. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out nothing more than a simple folded receipt, and placed it gently on the empty chair beside her without a word, the motion so casual it almost went unnoticed. "Take care of her," he said quietly, stepping back at last, creating distance like he was giving her the space she demanded, and before she could respond, before she could question him, he turned and walked down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the low murmur of the hospital. Until he was just another shadow among many. Emma stared after him, her heart beating faster than it should, a strange unease settling in her chest, and for a moment she considered ignoring it, letting the encounter dissolve into the long list of things she didn't have time to understand, but something pulled her attention back to the chair beside her, to the folded paper he'd left behind. Slowly, carefully, she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the receipt, and her breath caught when she saw the total, $1, $620.00, marked clearly as paid in full, no balance remaining, no explanation attached, just a quiet, undeniable fact that didn't make sense. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she looked back down the empty hallway where he had disappeared, her mind racing, trying to piece together something that fit, something logical. But all she could hear, over and over again, was his voice, steady and certain, echoing in a place she didn't recognize. Not that night. The receipt felt heavier than paper should have, like it carried something more than numbers, and Emma stared at it for longer than she meant to, her mind trying to catch up with what her eyes were already seeing, because there was no signature, no note, no explanation, just the total marked paid and the quiet implication that someone had stepped into her life and erased a problem she had been bracing herself to carry for weeks. Maybe months, and that alone should have felt like relief, but instead it made her uneasy in a way she could not explain. She folded the paper slowly, carefully, as if it might disappear if she moved too fast, and slipped it into the side pocket of her worn diaper bag, her fingers brushing against a nearly empty pack of wipes and a single spare bottle, reminders of the reality waiting for her outside these walls. And when she looked down at Lily, the baby's tiny face relaxed in sleep, she forced herself to focus on that instead. On the steady rhythm of her breathing, on something she could understand. "We are okay," she whispered under her breath, though she was not sure if she was saying it for Lily or for herself. The nurse at the front desk called her name a few minutes later, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversations and distant footsteps, and Emma stood quickly, adjusting Lily against her shoulder before walking over, her movements careful but practiced, the kind of efficiency that came from doing everything alone for too long. "You are all set," the nurse said with a small, polite smile, glancing at the computer screen before handing her a printed discharge form. "The balance has been taken care of." Emma hesitated, searching the nurse's face for some sign that this was a mistake, some indication that she should question it, but the woman had already moved on to the next patient, the moment passing as if it was routine, as if strangers paying hospital bills happened every day. Outside, the early morning air was cooler than she expected, a soft breeze moving through the parking lot as the first light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, painting everything in pale shades of gray and gold, and Emma paused just beyond the automatic doors, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, as she took a breath that felt deeper than any she had taken in hours. Her car sat 3 rows down, an aging sedan with a dented bumper and a back seat cluttered with blankets and baby supplies, a small, imperfect space that still felt more familiar than anything inside the hospital, and she started toward it, her steps steady but her thoughts anything but. She should have felt grateful, and part of her did, quietly, reluctantly, but gratitude came with questions, and questions came with the image of him standing in that hallway, calm, certain, like he had every right to be there, like he had every right to know her, and that was the part she could not accept. As she reached the car, she opened the back door first, carefully placing Lily into the car seat and adjusting the straps with practiced hands, her fingers moving automatically even as her mind drifted back to his voice, to the way he had said those words without hesitation, without doubt, as if the past he spoke of was something solid, something real. She closed the door gently, then moved to the driver's seat, sliding in and resting her hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine, the quiet inside the car wrapping around her like a pause she had not planned for. For a moment, she let herself sit there, the weight of everything pressing in at once, and then, almost without thinking, she reached for the diaper bag again, pulling out the folded receipt and staring at it once more, as if it might reveal something new the second time around. But it did not change. The numbers were still there, the confirmation still clear, and beneath it all, the same unanswered question lingered. Why would a stranger do this? Her phone buzzed suddenly in the cup holder, the sharp vibration breaking through her thoughts, and she glanced down to see an unknown number flashing across the screen, the digits unfamiliar but persistent, ringing once, twice, 3 times, and she hesitated, her thumb hovering just above the answer button as a quiet instinct told her to ignore it. To keep her world small and manageable and free of whatever complication this was becoming. But another part of her, the part that had already been pulled into something she did not understand, pressed accept before she could stop herself. "Hello?" she said cautiously, her voice lower now, guarded, and there was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to make her wonder if the call had dropped, before a familiar voice answered, calm and unmistakable. You left before I could make sure you had a way home. Emma's grip tightened slightly on the phone, her pulse quickening as she stared straight ahead at the empty parking lot, her reflection faint in the windshield, and for a second she considered hanging up, pretending she had not heard him, pretending none of this was happening, but instead she exhaled slowly and said, I told you, we are strangers. There was no frustration in her tone this time, only distance, something deliberate, something chosen, and on the other end, she heard the faintest hint of movement, like he had shifted his stance, like he had expected that answer. Emma, he said quietly, and the way he said her name, without hesitation, without question, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. You can keep saying that if it makes you feel safer. He paused, just long enough for the silence to settle again, and then added, softer this time. But it does not make it true. Emma did not respond right away, her fingers tightening around the phone as she stared through the windshield at nothing in particular, the world outside her car beginning to wake up while hers felt like it had been quietly pulled into something she did not agree to understand, and the way he said her name, steady and certain, echoed in her mind like a detail she should recognize but could not place. Like hearing a song you once knew but no longer remembered the words to. How do you know my name? She asked finally, her voice calm but edged with something sharper underneath, something protective, because names mattered, and she had spent too long guarding hers, keeping her life small and contained, to let a stranger speak it like it belonged to him. There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was choosing how much truth to give and how much to hold back. Because I have been looking for you, he said, and the simplicity of the answer made her chest tighten in a way she did not expect, not because it sounded romantic or reassuring, but because it sounded real, grounded in something she could not see but could feel pressing against the edges of her understanding. Emma let out a quiet breath, shaking her head even though he could not see it. People do not just look for someone for no reason, she replied, her tone firm now, the kind she used when she needed to draw a line and hold it. And they definitely do not pay hospital bills for strangers. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, like something unspoken had settled between them, and for a moment she thought he might end the call, might step back the way most people did when things became complicated, but instead his voice came back softer this time, lower, carrying something she could not quite name. You are right, he said. They do not. Emma swallowed, her eyes drifting to the rearview mirror where she could see Lily sleeping peacefully in the back seat, unaware of the quiet shift happening in her mother's world, and that steadied her, grounded her in something she could not afford to lose. Then explain it, she said, more quietly now, not demanding, but needing something that made sense. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his words came slower, more deliberate, like each one carried weight he did not take lightly. That night, he began, and the phrase alone was enough to make something flicker again in Emma's mind, something distant and blurred, like light through rain on a window. You were not supposed to be alone. Emma closed her eyes for a second, her grip tightening on the steering wheel as a faint sound rose in her memory, not clear, not complete, just fragments, the echo of rain hitting pavement, the low hum of a car engine, the feeling of being too tired to think straight, too overwhelmed to hold on to details, and she opened her eyes quickly, pushing it away before it could form into something she could not control. I do not remember anything like that, she said, her voice steady again, controlled, even as her pulse betrayed her, beating just a little faster than before. I figured you might say that, he replied, not with frustration, not with disbelief, but with something that sounded almost like understanding, and that unsettled her more than anything else. People remember things differently when they are under pressure, he continued, especially when they are trying to get through something alone. Emma exhaled slowly, leaning back against the seat, her head resting briefly as she looked up at the pale ceiling of her car, feeling the weight of his words settle in places she had not let herself revisit in a long time. You are talking like you were there, she said, her voice quieter now, less defensive, more uncertain despite herself. I was, he answered simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no room for doubt, just a quiet certainty that made the space between them feel smaller, more personal than it had any right to be. Emma shook her head again, though this time it felt less like denial and more like confusion, like she was trying to realign something that refused to fit. If that is true, she said slowly, choosing each word with care, then why do I not remember you? The question hung in the air, heavier than anything she had said before, and for a moment she wondered if he would answer it at all, if this was the point where whatever this was began to unravel. But instead she heard him take a quiet breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper now, something that felt less like explanation and more like truth. Because you did not see me, he said. Not the way you think you would have. Emma frowned slightly, her brow tightening as she tried to understand what that meant, but before she could respond, before she could press further, he added one more thing, softer now, almost like a confession he had not planned to make. But I saw you, he said, and I never forgot. The words settled into the silence that followed, and for the first time since the call began, Emma did not immediately push back, did not correct him or distance herself, because something about the way he said it did not feel like a claim, it felt like a memory, and whether she recognized it or not, it was beginning to feel like one that mattered. Emma stayed silent after his last words, the quiet inside the car stretching longer than it should, her thoughts no longer moving in straight lines but circling, returning again and again to the same place, to the way he spoke as if the past was not something distant but something still present, still unfinished, and that unsettled her more than anything else, because she had built her life carefully around what she remembered, around what she could explain, and anything that did not fit into that structure felt like a crack she could not afford to let widen. You are asking me to believe something I cannot even see, she said finally, her voice softer now but still guarded, her eyes drifting once more to the rearview mirror where Lily slept, small and peaceful, untouched by any of this. I am not asking you to believe anything, he replied, his tone calm, almost patient. I am asking you to stop assuming that what you remember is the whole story. Emma let out a quiet breath, the words settling into her mind in a way she did not like, because there was a difference between forgetting something and never knowing it at all, and the idea that there were pieces of her own life missing, pieces someone else seemed to hold, made her chest tighten with something close to fear. She shifted in her seat, straightening slightly as if posture alone could give her back control. Then tell me, she said more firmly now. Tell me what happened that night. There was no immediate answer, only the faint sound of his breathing on the other end of the line, steady and measured, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might keep holding on to whatever version of the truth he believed in. But then he spoke, his voice lower now, quieter, as if the memory itself required a different tone. It was raining, he began, and the simplicity of the detail sent a small, sharp echo through Emma's mind, something almost familiar. Not light rain, not the kind you ignore, but the kind that makes the streets look like mirrors and everything feels slower than it should. Emma closed her eyes briefly, and this time she did not push the feeling away, she let it linger, let the faint image form, blurred and incomplete. But there, the glow of street lights reflecting off wet pavement, the sound of tires moving through water, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. You were standing outside a closed building, he continued, holding your phone like you were waiting for it to change something, like you were hoping someone would answer who already had not. Emma's fingers tightened slightly around the phone in her hand, her breathing slowing as the fragments grew clearer, not full memories, but impressions, emotions she had buried because they had not led anywhere she could use. You looked like you had not slept in days, he said, and there was no judgment in it, only observation. And you were trying to pretend you were fine. A quiet, almost bitter smile touched Emma's lips without her realizing it, because that part at least sounded familiar, too familiar, like something she had done more times than she could count. I stopped, he added after a moment. I was not planning to, but I did. Emma opened her eyes again, her gaze fixed forward, her mind trying to follow the path he was laying out, trying to see where it intersected with her own. Why? She asked, the question simple but carrying more weight than it seemed. There was a pause, not hesitation, but something closer to reflection, like he was remembering not just what happened but why it mattered. Because you did not ask for help, he said, and somehow that made it impossible to leave. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and Emma felt something shift again, something deeper this time, because that was the part she recognized most, the instinct to handle everything alone, to carry more than she should without letting it show, and the idea that someone had seen that, had understood it in that moment, made her chest tighten in a way she could not easily dismiss. "I do not remember you stopping," she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it had carried before, and that difference did not go unnoticed, not by her, not by him. "You would not," he replied gently. "Not at first." Emma frowned slightly, her mind catching on that phrase, the implication behind it, and before she could question it, before she could pull the thread further, he continued, his voice steady but softer now. "You did not trust me," he said, "but you stayed anyway." The words lingered, opening something she had kept closed for a long time, and for the first time since this conversation began, Emma did not push back immediately, did not correct him or deny it, because somewhere beneath the uncertainty, beneath the confusion, there was a quiet, uncomfortable feeling that what he was saying was not entirely unfamiliar, and that was what scared her the most. Emma's breath slowed, but not because she felt calm, it slowed because her mind was working harder now, pulling at pieces she had long buried, pieces that never made sense on their own but now, placed beside his words, began to form something unsettlingly close to a story, and she did not like that feeling, because it meant there were parts of her life she had not been in control of remembering. "I stayed," she repeated quietly, almost to herself, her fingers tightening around the edge of the steering wheel as her gaze drifted unfocused past the windshield, seeing not the empty parking lot but something else, something older, something dimly lit and edged with rain. "You were going to leave," he continued, his voice steady, not forcing, not rushing, just laying each detail down like it mattered. "You said you did not need help, that you had everything handled, but you did not move." Emma swallowed, a faint pressure building in her chest, because that sounded exactly like her, the way she had always been, the way she had survived everything else, and hearing it said out loud, hearing it reflected back at her by someone who claimed to have seen it in a moment she could not fully recall, made it harder to dismiss. "You asked me what time it was?" he added, and that detail, small and ordinary, struck something sharper than anything else had so far, because it felt real, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a simple human thing that did not belong to imagination. Emma's brow furrowed slightly, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came, because for the first time she felt it clearly, not a full memory, but a sensation, the weight of her phone in her hand, the glow of the screen, the frustration of waiting for something that never came, and she exhaled slowly, her voice quieter when she finally spoke. "That does not mean anything," she said, but there was less certainty in it now, less distance. "It means you were trying to stay grounded," he replied gently, "when everything else felt like it was slipping." Emma closed her eyes again, this time longer, letting the silence stretch, letting his words settle into the spaces she had kept closed, and for a moment she let herself feel it, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet kind of fear that came not from something happening but from nothing happening at all, from waiting and realizing no one was coming. "You said someone was supposed to pick you up," he continued, his tone unchanged, but the weight of what he was saying pressed harder now. "And when I asked if you wanted me to wait with you, you said no, but you did not leave." Emma's grip on the phone tightened, her heart beating faster as the fragments aligned more clearly, the outline of a night she had pushed aside because it had not led anywhere she could use, because it had ended without resolution, without closure. "I do not remember who I was waiting for," she admitted quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and the admission itself felt like a crack opening, small but undeniable. There was a brief pause, and when he spoke again, his voice softened even more. "That is because they never came," he said. The words landed heavier than anything else had, not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that made Emma's chest tighten, because that feeling, that exact kind of ending, was something she knew too well, something she had lived through more than once. She opened her eyes, staring straight ahead again, her reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time she did not immediately push his version of the story away, because parts of it were starting to feel less like his and more like something that had always been hers, just incomplete. "So what?" she said after a moment, her voice steady but quieter, less defensive now. "You saw me on a bad night, you decided to help, and that is supposed to mean something now." It was a challenge, but not as sharp as before, more like she was testing the ground beneath her, trying to understand where it would hold and where it would break. On the other end of the line, he let the question settle, not rushing to answer, and when he finally did, his voice carried something different, something deeper than explanation. "It means I stayed," he said simply. Emma's breath caught slightly, her mind catching on the word in a way she could not immediately explain, because staying was not something people did, not without a reason, not without something tying them there, and the way he said it made it sound like that choice had mattered more than anything else. "People do not stay for no reason," she said quietly, echoing her earlier words without realizing it, and this time, when he responded, there was no pause at all. "You are right," he said, his voice steady, certain in a way that did not feel forced. "They do not." The silence that followed was different now, not empty, not tense, but full of something unspoken, something waiting just beneath the surface, and Emma felt it, felt the shift from confusion into something more dangerous, something closer to understanding, even if she was not ready to accept it yet, and for the first time since the conversation began, she realized this was not just about a night she could not remember. It was about something that had continued long after it ended, something he had carried forward while she had left it behind, and that difference, that imbalance, was beginning to feel impossible to ignore. Emma did not answer right away, because something about the way he said it stayed with her longer than it should have, the word itself echoing in her mind like it carried more weight than the conversation allowed, and she realized that this was no longer just about understanding a night she could not fully remember. It was about understanding why he had not let it go when she had. She shifted slightly in her seat, her hand resting on the steering wheel as her gaze dropped briefly to the dashboard clock, the minutes passing quietly, grounding her in the present even as her thoughts drifted backward into something less certain. "If you stay," she said slowly, choosing her words more carefully now. "Then what happened after that?" There was no challenge in her tone this time, no attempt to push him away, only a quiet need to understand where the story went, where it had diverged from what she believed her life to be. On the other end, he did not answer immediately, and she could almost imagine him standing somewhere still, composed, thinking not about what to say but about how much to say, because whatever this was, it clearly mattered to him in a way that was not simple or casual. "You stopped shaking," he said finally, his voice softer now, more reflective, as if he was no longer just telling her what happened but remembering it in real time. "Not all at once, but enough that you could stand without holding on to the wall." Emma's fingers tightened slightly as he spoke, because that detail landed differently, not just as information but as sensation, a faint memory of cold seeping through her clothes, of her body reacting before her mind could keep up, and she exhaled quietly, letting the feeling pass through her instead of pushing it away. "You told me you had somewhere to be in the morning," he continued, "and that you could not afford to get sick." Emma let out a quiet breath, a small, almost humorless sound escaping her as she shook her head slightly, because that part sounded exactly like her, practical even when she should not have been, focused on what came next even when she was still dealing with what had already happened. "That sounds like something I would say," she admitted, her voice softer now, less guarded, and he responded without hesitation. "It is," he said simply. The certainty in his voice no longer felt intrusive, it felt consistent, like a thread running through everything he had told her so far, and that consistency was what made it harder to dismiss. "I offered to call you a ride," he added after a moment, "but you said no again." Emma frowned slightly, her mind following the pattern, recognizing it even if she could not fully see it. "And I stayed anyway," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, testing the logic of it, and she heard the faintest hint of agreement in his next breath. You did, he confirmed. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was full, like both of them were standing on the edge of something neither had fully named yet, and Emma felt it, felt the shift in herself from resisting to listening, from dismissing to considering. So you stayed, she repeated, her voice steady now. And I stayed, and then what? This time the pause was longer, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, something more personal, less observational. You sat down, he said, on the curb, like you were too tired to pretend anymore. Emma closed her eyes briefly, and this time the image came clearer, not complete, but stronger than before, the rough edge of concrete beneath her, the dampness in the air, the quiet moment where everything she had been holding together felt like it might finally come apart, and she inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling with a memory she had not allowed herself to revisit. You asked me if I ever waited for something that never came, he continued, his voice low, steady. And I told you yes. Emma's breath caught slightly at that, her eyes opening again as she stared straight ahead, because that question felt too specific, too real to be imagined, and the idea that she had asked it, that she had let that part of herself show to someone she did not even remember, made her feel exposed in a way she could not easily explain. And what did I say? She asked quietly, her voice almost hesitant now, as if she was no longer sure she wanted to hear the answer but needed it anyway. On the other end, there was no hesitation this time, no pause to soften the truth. You said it hurt more when you stopped expecting them, he replied, his voice gentle but certain. Because then there was nothing left to hold on to. The words settled into the silence between them, and Emma felt something shift inside her, something deeper than confusion or doubt, something closer to recognition, because even if she could not remember saying it, she knew it was true, she knew it was something she had felt before, something she had carried without naming. She swallowed slowly, her hand resting against her chest for a moment as if to steady herself, and for the first time since this conversation began, she did not question whether he had been there, she questioned how much of herself he had seen that night, how much she had revealed without realizing it. Why would you stay for that? She asked finally, her voice softer than before, less guarded, more human, and this time, when he answered, there was no distance in his tone at all, only something simple and honest. Because you did not deserve to go through it alone, he said. The words were quiet, almost understated, but they carried a weight that settled deeply, and Emma felt it, felt the difference between hearing something and understanding it, because for the first time, this was not just a story he was telling, it was a choice he had made, one that had extended beyond a single moment, one that had followed her into a life she had built without knowing he was part of it, and that realization, more than anything else, made it impossible to pretend this was nothing. Emma did not realize she had been holding her breath until she slowly let it go, the air leaving her lungs in a quiet, unsteady exhale as his words settled deeper than anything else he had said so far, because this was no longer about fragments or guesses, this was about something that felt undeniably real, something that connected to parts of her she had not let herself revisit in a long time. And that connection was what made it difficult to keep her distance. She glanced again at the rearview mirror, at Lily's small form resting peacefully in the back seat, and for a moment everything felt still, like the world had paused just long enough for her to feel the weight of what was happening without distraction. You stayed, she repeated again, but this time it was not a question, not even a challenge, it was a realization, quiet but firm, like she was finally acknowledging something she could not keep pushing aside. On the other end of the line, his silence was not empty, it was steady, like he was giving her the space to arrive at that conclusion on her own. Most people do not, she added after a moment, her voice softer now, thoughtful in a way it had not been before, because she knew that truth better than she wanted to admit. She had lived it, over and over again, in different ways, with different people, always ending the same. I know, he said simply, and there was something in those two words that made her chest tighten, not because they were dramatic, but because they carried an understanding that did not need to be explained. Emma shifted slightly in her seat, her hand resting loosely on the steering wheel now, her posture no longer rigid with defense but still careful, still aware, because even as she allowed herself to listen, she had not forgotten how easily trust could be misplaced. "So you stayed," she said again, more slowly this time, as if she was trying to trace the path step by step. "And we talked, and I asked you things I probably should not have." "Asked a stranger?" There was the faintest hint of something in her tone now, not quite humor, not quite regret, but something softer, something human. "You asked me things most people do not say out loud," he replied, and this time there was a subtle warmth in his voice, not amusement, not judgment, just recognition of a moment that had mattered more than either of them expected. Emma let out a small breath, her eyes lowering briefly as she processed that, because it felt right. It felt like something she might have done when she was too tired to filter herself, when the weight of everything became too much to carry quietly. "And you answered," she said, almost under her breath, piecing it together as she went. "I did," he confirmed. The simplicity of it made something in her chest shift again, because answers were not something she had often received when she needed them, not without conditions, not without complications, and the idea that someone had simply stayed and answered, without expectation, without demand, felt unfamiliar in a way that made her pause. "Why?" she asked again, but this time the question was different, not defensive, not skeptical, but genuinely searching, because she needed to understand what would make someone choose that, what would make someone remain in a moment that was not theirs to carry. There was a brief silence, and then his voice came back, quieter now, more personal than before. "Because you asked like it mattered," he said. Emma's breath caught slightly at that, her eyes lifting again to the empty space beyond the windshield, because there was something about that answer that felt too close, too accurate, like he had seen something she did not even realize she was showing. "It did matter," she said softly, almost without thinking, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and as soon as she said it, she realized how true it was, how much those questions had meant in that moment, even if she had never carried them forward. "I know," he replied, and again there was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet certainty. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but full in a way that felt almost fragile, like something had shifted between them that could not easily be undone. Emma leaned back slightly in her seat, her hand moving absently to rest over her chest again, as if grounding herself in something physical while her thoughts continued to move through unfamiliar territory. "If all of that is true," she said slowly, her voice steady but thoughtful, "then why did it end like that?" This time, the pause on the other end was longer, heavier, and for the first time since the conversation began, she felt something change in the way he held the silence. Like this was the part that was not as easy to say, the part that carried something unresolved. "It did not end the way you think," he said finally, his voice quieter now, carrying something deeper beneath the calm, and Emma felt that shift immediately, felt the difference in tone like a subtle change in the air before a storm. Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone again, her focus sharpening as she leaned forward just a little, as if instinctively trying to get closer to something she could not yet see. "Then how did it end?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, because suddenly this mattered more than she expected, more than she was prepared for. On the other end, she heard him take a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his words were measured, deliberate, like he was stepping carefully through something that had stayed with him longer than it should have. "You fell asleep," he said. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate, a quiet ripple through her thoughts that brought with it a sensation she could not ignore, the faint memory of exhaustion finally catching up, of the world dimming not because it was safe but because she could not stay awake any longer. "And when I came back," he continued, his voice steady but lower now, "you were gone." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, and Emma felt it settle deep in her chest, because that was the part she recognized most, not the beginning, not the middle, but the ending, the pattern she knew too well, the moment where something that could have meant something simply disappeared without explanation, and for the first time, she did not just question his version of the story, she questioned her own. Emma felt the weight of his last words settle slowly, not all at once, but in layers, each one pressing deeper than the last, because "you were gone" was not just an ending, it was a pattern, one she had lived through in ways she could count, and in ways she had tried not to, and hearing it now from the other side, from someone who had been the one left behind, shifted something inside her that she could not easily explain. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying what her voice had not yet, and for a moment she did not say anything, because silence felt safer than admitting what was beginning to surface. "I would not just leave," she said finally, but the certainty in her tone was thinner now, less solid than before, because even as she said it, she could feel the edges of doubt forming, small but persistent. "You did not leave," he replied quietly, and there was no accusation in it, no blame, just a correction, gentle but firm. "You disappeared." The distinction mattered more than she wanted it to, and she frowned slightly, her mind catching on that word as if it held something she had not considered. "That is the same thing," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not entirely. "It is not," he said, his voice steady. "Leaving is a choice. Disappearing is something else." Emma swallowed slowly, her chest tightening as she leaned back against the seat, her gaze drifting again to the rearview mirror where Lily still slept, peaceful and unaware, and for a moment that image grounded her, reminded her of what she knew, what she could hold on to, but it did not erase the feeling that something important was just out of reach. "Then what happened?" she asked, her voice quieter now, not defensive, not challenging, just searching, because she needed to understand how a moment like that could end in a way she did not remember. There was a pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, not heavier, but more deliberate, like he was stepping carefully through something that had not faded with time. "I stepped away for a few minutes," he said, "to get you something warm, coffee, something you could hold on to." Emma closed her eyes briefly, and this time the image came clearer, the faint memory of cold pressing into her skin, the need for something to steady her, something simple, and she inhaled slowly, letting it come without pushing it away. "You were sitting there when I left," he continued, "wrapped in that thin jacket like it was enough to keep you from freezing." Emma's fingers tightened slightly, because that detail felt too specific, too real to ignore, and she could almost feel it now, the damp fabric, the chill that seeped through no matter how tightly she held it around herself. "And when I came back," he added, his voice quieter now, "there was an ambulance." The word landed softly, but the effect was immediate, a sharp, unexpected jolt through her chest, and her eyes opened quickly, her breath catching as something shifted, something stronger than the fragments before, something that felt closer to memory than imagination. "I do not remember that," she said quickly, but this time it was not denial, it was confusion, real and unguarded. "You would not," he replied gently. "You were already unconscious." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than anything else he had said, and Emma felt it settle into her chest, into the space where everything she knew about that night began to fracture. Unconscious. Not asleep. Not leaving. Something else. Something she had not allowed herself to consider. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest again, pressing lightly as if grounding herself, her breathing slower now but uneven, because this was no longer just a story he was telling, this was something that changed the way that night existed in her memory, or lack of it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, because suddenly the details mattered in a way they had not before, every word carrying weight she could feel building. "You passed out," he said simply. "Right there on the curb." Emma's mind raced, trying to align that with what she thought she knew, trying to fit it into the version of her life she had built, and it did not fit, not easily, not cleanly, because she remembered getting home that night, she remembered waking up the next morning, but everything in between had always been a blur she chose not to question. "And then what?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost fragile, because she was no longer sure she wanted to hear the answer but needed it anyway. On the other end, there was a brief pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper, something that had not been there before, something closer to truth than memory. "I stayed," he said, "until they took you." Emma's breath caught again, sharper this time, and for a moment she could not speak, because that word, stayed, had come back, but now it meant something more, something that extended beyond comfort or conversation, something that carried presence through a moment she had not even been aware of. "And after that," she whispered, her voice unsteady now. "What happened after that?" The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something unresolved, something that had not been said yet, and when he finally answered, his voice was softer than before, quieter in a way that felt almost careful. "I tried to find you," he said. The words landed slowly, but they did not fade, they stayed, echoing in a space that was no longer empty, and Emma felt it, felt the shift from confusion into something deeper, something that connected the past he remembered to the life she had lived without it, and for the first time, she realized this was not just about what happened that night, it was about everything that happened after. Everything she had never known someone else had been searching for. Emma did not realize she had leaned forward until her forehead nearly touched the steering wheel, her hand still pressed lightly against her chest as if she could steady something that had already begun to shift beyond her control, because his words were no longer just filling in gaps, they were rewriting the foundation of what she thought had happened, and that kind of realization did not settle quietly. "You tried to find me," she repeated slowly, her voice low, almost disbelieving, because that part did not fit into any version of her life she had ever considered, not once, not even in the quiet moments when she wondered if things could have been different. "I did," he said, and there was no hesitation, no need to justify it, just a quiet certainty that made it harder to dismiss than anything else he had told her so far. Emma swallowed, her mind moving quickly now, trying to trace the timeline she knew, trying to align his version with hers, and the more she tried, the more she realized there were entire spaces she had never questioned, spaces she had simply accepted as empty because she had no reason to believe otherwise. "That does not make sense," she said, her voice firmer now, not defensive, but grounded in the logic she had relied on for years. "If you tried to find me, then you would have found me." There was a brief pause on the other end, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, not in emotion, but in clarity, like he was stepping out of memory and into something more concrete. "I did not have your name," he said. "Not your full name, not anything I could use to track you the way you think." Emma frowned slightly, her fingers tightening around the phone again, because that detail mattered more than she wanted it to, and she could feel her resistance beginning to weaken under the weight of specifics. "You talked to me for hours," she said, the words coming faster now, her mind catching up to the implications. "And you are telling me you never got my name?" "You told me your first name," he replied, calm as ever. "And that was it." Emma's breath caught slightly, because that sounded exactly like something she would do, something she had done countless times, offering just enough to get through a moment without giving anything that could be carried forward, and hearing it now, reflected back at her, made it harder to deny. "Emma," she said quietly, almost to herself, as if testing the way it sounded in that memory, and on the other end, she heard the faintest shift, like he had been waiting for her to say it that way. "That is all I had," he confirmed. The silence that followed was heavier now, not because of what was being said, but because of what was starting to make sense, piece by piece, in ways she had not expected. Emma leaned back slightly, her eyes closing again as she tried to picture it, not just the night, but the aftermath, the hospital, the discharge, the way she had woken up with a dull ache and a vague memory of being helped but no clear face attached to it, and for the first time, she questioned that absence, not as something normal, but as something missing. "The hospital," she said slowly, her voice quieter now, more focused. "Did you follow me there?" "I did," he answered, and there was something in his tone that shifted again, something more grounded, less distant, like this part of the story belonged less to memory and more to reality. "They would not give me information," he continued, "not without proof of who I was to you, and I had none." Emma's chest tightened slightly at that, because that detail felt real in a way that was impossible to ignore, the kind of barrier she knew existed, The kind of rule that would have stopped anyone in that situation, no matter how much they wanted to help. "So you just left?" she said, but this time it was not an accusation, it was a question, a quiet attempt to understand where the line had been drawn. "No," he said, and the word came without pause, firm but not forceful. "I stayed as long as I could." Emma's eyes opened again, her gaze fixing on the empty space ahead of her, because that word had returned again, stayed, and each time he said it, it carried more meaning than before, more weight, more presence. "Then how did you lose me?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost reluctant, because part of her was beginning to understand the answer before he gave it. There was a brief silence, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that felt closer to regret than anything else he had allowed himself to show. "Because someone told me you had already been discharged," he said. Emma's brow furrowed immediately, her mind catching on that detail, because it did not align with what she remembered, not cleanly, not clearly. "That is not possible," she said, her voice sharper now, confusion cutting through the calm she had been trying to maintain. "I remember leaving in the morning." "You did," he replied, and there was no contradiction in his tone, only confirmation. "But not from the same place I was told." The words landed slowly, but their meaning was immediate, and Emma felt something shift again, something deeper this time, something that moved beyond memory and into something else entirely, something that suggested this was not just about what she forgot, but about what she had never been given the chance to know. Her grip on the phone tightened, her pulse quickening as the pieces began to move in a direction she had not expected, and for the first time since this conversation began, a new question formed, one she had not considered before. "Who told you that?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but edged with something new, something sharper, something closer to suspicion than confusion. On the other end, there was a pause, longer than any before it, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate, like he was stepping into something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. "That is the part," he said slowly. "I never stopped trying to understand." Emma felt the shift immediately, the moment his words stopped being just about the past and started pointing towards something unresolved, something that had never been explained, and that realization settled differently, heavier, sharper, because confusion she could manage, but the idea that something had been intentionally hidden from her was harder to ignore. She straightened slightly in her seat, her posture tightening again, not out of defense this time, but focus, as if something inside her had quietly aligned into place. "You think someone lied," she said, her voice steady, but there was something new beneath it now, something more deliberate, because this was no longer just about memory, it was about truth. On the other end, there was no hesitation. "I know they did," he replied, and the certainty in his voice carried a weight that made it difficult to dismiss, not emotional, not reactive, just grounded in something he had already considered, already questioned more than once. Emma exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the steering wheel again as her fingers traced along the worn edge, grounding herself in something physical, while her thoughts moved quickly through unfamiliar territory. "That does not make sense," she said, though the words felt less solid than before. "Why would anyone do that?" The question lingered, not just between them, but within her, because it forced her to consider something she had never needed to before, the possibility that her life had been influenced by something she had not seen, something she had not chosen. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, not uncertain but careful, like he was stepping into something that required more than just memory. "That is what I asked myself," he said. "For a long time." Emma closed her eyes briefly, her breath slow and controlled, because she could feel the conversation moving somewhere deeper, somewhere that was no longer just about understanding him, but about understanding something in her own life that had never fully made sense. "And you never found out?" she asked quietly. "Not then," he replied, and the way he said it made her eyes open again, her attention sharpening immediately, because that answer did not close anything, it opened it. "What do you mean, not then?" she asked, her voice more focused now, more intent, because suddenly this mattered in a way she could not ignore. There was a slight shift on the other end, like he had moved, like he was no longer standing still, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something different, something that belonged more to the present than the past. "I let it go," he said. "At least that is what I told myself." Emma frowned slightly, her brow tightening as she listened, because that did not sound like the end of a story, it sounded like something unfinished. "But you did not," she said quietly, more statement than question, and this time, there was the faintest hint of something in his response, not quite emotion, but something close. "No," he admitted. The word was simple, but it carried more than anything else he had said, because it confirmed what she was beginning to understand, that whatever had happened that night had not stayed in the past for him, it had followed him forward, quietly, persistently. "So what changed?" she asked, her voice softer now, but steady, because if he had let it go, even briefly, then something must have brought it back, something must have made him start looking again. There was a pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more deliberate, like he was choosing how to say something that mattered. "You did," he said. Emma blinked, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone as her breath caught, because that answer did not make sense, not immediately, not in any way that fit into what she knew. "That is not possible," she said, her voice steady but edged with confusion. "We just met again today." "No," he replied gently. "We crossed paths before that." The words landed slowly, but their meaning was immediate, and Emma felt something shift again, something deeper, something that reached into her recent past instead of the distant one she had been trying to piece together. "When?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant, because suddenly she was not sure she wanted the answer but needed it anyway. On the other end, there was no hesitation this time. "3 weeks ago," he said. Emma's breath caught again, sharper this time, her mind immediately searching, scanning through recent days, recent routines, trying to find something that matched, something that stood out, but everything felt the same, ordinary, predictable, until one small detail surfaced, something she had not thought about twice. "That is not possible," she said again, but this time the certainty was gone, replaced by something else, something closer to realization. "You were at the grocery store," he continued, his voice steady, each word placed with quiet precision. "You were counting coins at the register, trying to make up the difference for a Kenna formula." Emma's hand froze where it rested, her breath catching as the memory hit fully this time, clear, undeniable, the fluorescent lights, the line behind her. The quiet embarrassment she had tried to ignore, and the man standing just a few steps back, someone she had not looked at long enough to remember. "You did not recognize me," he said softly. "But I recognized you." The words settled into the silence that followed, and Emma felt it, felt the connection snap into place between then and now, between the past she could not remember, and the present she had lived without knowing it was connected, and for the first time since this conversation began, she understood something clearly. This was not a coincidence. It was something that had been moving toward her long before she realized it existed. Emma felt the memory hit her fully this time, not as fragments or impressions, but as something complete, something undeniable, and it did not arrive gently, it settled into her chest with a quiet weight that made everything else fall still for a moment, because she remembered that day, she remembered the coins, the way her fingers had trembled slightly as she counted them under the harsh fluorescent lights. The quiet pressure of people waiting behind her, the way she had tried to pretend it did not matter, that it was normal, that she had everything under control when she clearly did not. Her grip on the phone tightened as her eyes closed briefly, replaying it now with a clarity she had not allowed herself before, the cashier's polite but strained patience, the total just a few dollars beyond what she had, the brief pause where she had calculated what she could put back, what Lily needed more, what she could sacrifice this time, and then the quiet voice behind her, calm, composed, offering to cover the difference, as if it was nothing. "That was you," she said softly, not as a question, but as a realization she could no longer deny, and on the other end, his response came without hesitation. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer only made it heavier, because it confirmed what she was already beginning to understand, that he had not just appeared today, he had been there before, watching, recognizing, choosing not to say anything, and that choice, more than anything else, made her chest tighten in a way she could not ignore. "Why did you not say anything?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less guarded, more vulnerable than she intended, because this was no longer about disbelief, it was about understanding intention, about trying to make sense of why someone would step into her life twice and still remain unseen. There was a brief pause, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something deeper, something more personal. "Because you did not need recognition," he said. "You needed help." Emma's breath caught slightly at that, her hand instinctively moving to rest against her chest again, because that answer felt too close, too accurate, like he had seen through something she had tried to keep hidden even from herself. "And saying who I was would have changed that moment," he continued. "It would have made it about something else." Emma let out a slow breath, her mind moving through that explanation, turning it over, testing it, and the more she thought about it, the more it made sense in a way she had not expected, because she knew how she would have reacted. She knew she would have pulled back, refused the help, tried to hold on to whatever pride she had left, even if it cost her more in the end. "So you just walked away?" she said quietly, but this time there was no accusation in her tone, only a quiet attempt to follow the logic of it. "No," he replied, and again that word came without hesitation, steady and certain. "I stayed until you left." Emma frowned slightly, her brow tightening as she processed that, because once again, that word returned, stayed, and each time it did, it carried more meaning, more presence, more weight than she could easily ignore. "You always stay," she said, almost under her breath, the realization forming without her fully intending it, and on the other end, there was a brief silence, not empty, but acknowledging, like he understood what she was recognizing before she fully said it. "I try to," he replied quietly. The simplicity of it made something in her chest shift again, something softer this time, less defensive, more open, because this was no longer about proving anything, it was about understanding a pattern, a choice that had been consistent in ways she had never experienced before. "And today," she said slowly, her voice steady but thoughtful, "you recognized me again." "I did," he confirmed. Emma glanced once more at the rearview mirror, at Lily's small form resting peacefully in the back seat, and for a moment everything aligned in a way that felt almost overwhelming, the past, the present, the connections she had not seen, the moments she had lived without knowing they were part of something larger. "And this time you decided to say something," she added, her voice quieter now, more reflective. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something deeper, something that felt closer to truth than anything else he had said so far. "Because this time," he said, "you said we were strangers." The words settled into the silence that followed, and Emma felt it, felt the difference in that moment, the shift from quiet presence to something that could no longer remain unspoken, because denying something did not make it disappear, and for the first time, she understood why he had responded the way he did, why he had not let her words stand without challenge. Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone as she leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady now, her thoughts no longer scattered but focused in a way they had not been before. "So you have been there," she said slowly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that had not been there at the beginning of this conversation. "More than once?" "Yes," he answered simply. The silence that followed was not uncertain anymore, it was full, grounded in something that had moved beyond coincidence, beyond confusion, into something that felt intentional, something that had been building without her knowing it. Emma exhaled slowly, her hand resting lightly against her chest again as she processed everything, the past she was beginning to remember, the present she was finally understanding, and the connection between them that she could no longer dismiss. "Then there is still something missing," she said quietly, her voice steady but thoughtful, because even with everything he had told her, even with everything she was beginning to see, there was still a piece that did not fit, something that had not yet been explained. On the other end, there was no hesitation this time. "There is," he said. Emma's gaze sharpened slightly, her focus narrowing as she prepared to ask the question that had been forming since he mentioned the hospital, since he mentioned someone telling him she was gone. "Who told you I had already been discharged?" she asked, her voice calm but precise, because now she understood that this was not just about memory or misunderstanding, this was about something that had been deliberately set in motion. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not uncertain, but deliberate, like he was stepping into something that had waited long enough, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more measured, carrying a truth that had not yet been said out loud. "Someone who knew your name," he said. Emma felt the words settle in a way nothing else had, slower this time, deeper, because "someone who knew your name" was no longer abstract, it was specific, it pointed somewhere, to someone, and that made everything shift from confusion into something sharper, something closer to truth, and she realized she was no longer trying to remember just for herself, she was trying to understand who had been there, who had seen her, who had made a choice that changed everything without her knowing it. Her grip on the phone tightened slightly as she sat up straighter in her seat, her mind moving quickly now, not scattered like before but focused, tracing back through the only people who could have known her name that night, the few connections she still had at that time, the ones she had trusted, even briefly. "That does not make sense," she said quietly, but this time it was not denial, it was calculation, because the list was small, smaller than she wanted it to be, and that made the answer feel closer than she was ready for. "It does," he replied, his voice steady, not pushing, not forcing, just holding the space for her to arrive at the conclusion herself. Emma swallowed slowly, her eyes drifting to the side window where the early light had grown brighter, the world continuing forward as if nothing had changed, even as everything inside her felt like it was shifting into place piece by piece. "You said they told you I was discharged," she said, her voice more focused now, each word deliberate. "That means they were at the hospital." "Yes," he confirmed. Emma closed her eyes briefly, her mind pulling at the memory again, the morning after, the quiet confusion she had woken up with, the nurse explaining she had been brought in overnight, the lack of details she had accepted without question because she had been too tired, too overwhelmed to push further, and now, for the first time, she questioned that absence, not as something normal, but as something missing. "I did not give my name to anyone else," she said slowly, her voice quieter now, more certain in this part at least, because that had always been her rule: keep things small, keep things contained, do not give more than necessary. "You did not have to," he replied gently. "They already knew it." The words landed softly, but their meaning was immediate, and Emma felt something tighten in her chest, something sharper this time, because that narrowed it down even further, to someone who had not just been present, but already connected to her life in a way that could not be dismissed. "Who?" she asked, her voice steady but lower now, because this was no longer a question she could ask lightly. This was something that would change the way she saw that entire moment, that entire part of her past. There was a pause on the other end, not hesitation, but something more deliberate, like he was allowing her one more moment to think before he said it out loud. "He said he was your emergency contact," Alexander answered finally. The world seemed to still for a second, not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet pause that made everything else fade slightly into the background, because Emma knew exactly what that meant, exactly who that could be, and she did not need to search for the answer, it was already there. Her hand tightened around the phone as her breath caught, her mind immediately pulling up the only name that fit, the only person who had ever insisted on being listed that way, even when she had not wanted to rely on him, even when she had known better. "No," she said quietly, but the word lacked strength, it lacked certainty, because even as she said it, the pieces were already aligning, already forming a picture she could not ignore. "He told them you did not have anyone else," Alexander continued, his voice steady, not adding anything, not interpreting, just stating what he had been told. "That he would take care of it." Emma closed her eyes again, this time longer, her breath uneven now, because that part felt familiar in a way she had not wanted to admit, the way things had been handled without her input, the way decisions had been made for her when she was not in a position to question them. "That does not mean anything," she said, but this time it sounded weaker, more like something she was trying to hold on to than something she believed. "He told me you had already left," Alexander said quietly. "That you did not want to be contacted." The words settled heavily, and this time, Emma did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to push against, nothing left to deny without ignoring what she already knew, and the silence that followed was different, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something that had finally taken shape, something that connected the night she could not remember to the life she had built without all the answers. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze steady now, no longer searching, no longer confused, just focused in a way it had not been before, because now the question was no longer what happened, it was why. "He lied," she said quietly, the words simple but carrying a weight that settled deep, because saying it out loud made it real in a way it had not been before, and once it was real, it could not be ignored. On the other end, Alexander did not correct her, did not soften it, did not add anything unnecessary. "Yes," he said. The confirmation did not come as a shock, it came as something else, something heavier, something that settled into a place she had kept guarded for a long time, because this was not just about that night anymore, it was about everything that had followed, everything she had accepted without question. Everything she had built on a version of events that was no longer complete. Emma exhaled slowly, her hand resting once more against her chest as she stared ahead, her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but aligned in a way that made the truth impossible to ignore, and for the first time since this conversation began, she understood that the past she had been trying to remember was not just missing pieces, it had been changed, quietly, deliberately, by someone she had once trusted. Emma did not speak for a long moment after that, not because she did not have anything to say, but because for the first time, everything made sense in a way that left no room for doubt, no space for denial, and that kind of clarity did not arrive loudly, it settled quietly, deeply, like something that had been waiting for her to be ready to see it. Her fingers loosened slightly around the phone as she leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady now, no longer searching for answers but absorbing them, letting them take their place in a story she had lived without fully understanding. "I thought I left," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, not questioning anymore, just acknowledging the version of events she had carried for so long, the version that had allowed her to move forward without looking back. On the other end, Alexander did not interrupt, did not correct her, he simply let her continue, as if he understood that this part belonged to her more than it ever had to him. "I thought I chose that," she added, her hand resting lightly against her chest again, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, grounding herself in the present as the past shifted into something new. "You did not," he replied gently, and this time, the words did not feel like a contradiction, they felt like a truth she had already accepted. Emma nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, because she understood now, understood that what she had believed was not entirely hers, that part of it had been shaped by someone else's decision, someone else's choice to speak on her behalf when she could not. Her gaze drifted once more to the rearview mirror, to Lily, still sleeping peacefully. Her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that felt certain, untouched by anything that had come before, and for a moment, Emma felt a quiet sense of clarity settle over her, something that went beyond the confusion, beyond the questions, into something simpler. "He made that choice for me," she said quietly, the words carrying no anger, no sharp edge, just recognition, because now that she saw it, she could not unsee it. "Yes," Alexander said, and again, there was no attempt to soften it, no need to explain it further, because the truth had already taken its place. Emma exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because the unknown had become known, and that alone changed the weight of it. "And you stayed," she said, her voice softer now, returning to that word that had followed through every part of his story, that had remained constant even when everything else had been uncertain. "I did," he replied. The simplicity of it no longer surprised her, it made sense now, it fit into the pattern she had begun to see, not just in what he had done, but in who he was, someone who did not walk away when things became difficult, someone who remained even when there was no reason to. Emma let the silence settle for a moment, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just present, and then she spoke again, her voice steady, grounded in something she had not felt at the beginning of this conversation. "I do not remember everything," she said, honest in a way she had not allowed herself to be before. "But I remember enough now to know that you were there." There was a pause on the other end, and when Alexander spoke again, his voice carried something quieter, something that felt less like certainty and more like relief. "That is enough," he said. Emma felt something shift at that, something small but meaningful, because for the first time, this was not about proving anything, not about convincing her of something she could not see. It was about meeting somewhere in the middle, where memory and truth overlapped just enough to move forward. She glanced once more at Lily, then back at the empty space ahead of her, her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but aligned in a way that felt steady, grounded. "You said you tried to find me," she said, her voice calm now, not questioning, just acknowledging what he had told her. "I did," he confirmed. Emma nodded slightly again, her hand resting loosely on the steering wheel now, her posture no longer tense, no longer defensive, just present. "And now you have," she said quietly. The words settled between them, simple but complete, because this time, there was no misunderstanding, no missing piece, just the reality of where they were now, after everything that had been left unsaid for so long. On the other end, there was a brief pause, and when Alexander spoke again, his voice was steady, but softer than before. "Yes," he said. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, carrying everything they had uncovered, everything they had finally understood, and for the first time, Emma did not feel the need to fill it, did not feel the need to push it away. She sat there, her hand resting lightly against her chest once more, feeling the steady rhythm beneath it, grounding herself in the present, in the moment that had come after everything else. "We are not strangers," she said finally, her voice quiet but certain, not as a question, not as a doubt, but as a realization that had taken time to form. On the other end, Alexander did not respond right away, but when he did, his voice carried the same calm certainty it had from the beginning, only now it felt different, less distant, more understood. "No," he said. Emma let out a slow breath, her gaze softening slightly as she looked ahead, no longer trying to piece together what had been missing, because she already had enough to understand, enough to move forward, and in that quiet moment, she realized something simple but undeniable: he had remembered everything, and she had remembered just enough to know it mattered.